Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sophie Sykes-Gerald, and on behalf of the British Neuroscience Association, I'd like to give you a very warm welcome to the first webinar in this series, which is hosted with our annual supporters, the Psychiatry Consortium. Whilst online life is still very much part of the new normal, we'd like to note our real appreciation for your taking the time to share some screen time with us today. Just before we start, and whilst people are still joining us, we have a few housekeeping rules to go over. We will be using the chat and Q&A function today, so do feel free to say hello and post comments in the chat. But if you have specific questions for our speakers, then please make sure you use the Q&A function for these, and you should see both the chat and the Q&A buttons at the bottom of your screen. There will be a Q&A session after the talks with a chance for our panelists to answer any questions you may have. So do feel free to post your questions at any time during the talks, and we'll make sure we pick them up at the end. You can ask questions anonymously if you wish to do so. I'd also like to take the opportunity to remind you that this webinar is being recorded with the permission of our speakers and will be available to watch on demand on the BNA's YouTube channel after the event. And finally, just a reminder to please adhere to the BNA's Code of Conduct for webinars and engage respectfully online. We are delighted to be working with Laura Ajram and the Psychiatry Consortium, working together to strengthen the links between psychiatry and neuroscience, highlighting the importance of a collaborative process between industry and academia within psychiatric drug discovery. We really hope this series will help humanize the research story and provide an opportunity to openly discuss the different stages of the research pipeline from all perspectives, from people with lived experience of mental health and clinicians to academic researchers and industry scientists. As our friend and extraordinary patient advocate, Matt Eagle, says, drug discovery is about relationships and human interaction. The more human you can make it, the better. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Kevin Cox, currently chairman of 3 major businesses. Kevin has supported the BNA as a non-exec director for the past 8 years and has been integral to the building bridges between industry and academia work. Thank you, Kevin, and over to you.
Many thanks, Sophie, and welcome to all our listeners today. I will be chairing this session and also the 5th session in the series, and hopefully be able to have a really interesting wrap-up session after we've gone through all the individual components of this exciting program. I'd just like to point out that actually I'm now being told on occasion I have an unstable internet connection, which is just, of course, not the time you want to have it. But if perhaps I go offline for a moment in time, Laura, if you wouldn't mind stepping in and maybe sort of just keeping the proceedings going until it all comes back on again, that would be really helpful. As Sophie mentioned, we're really very pleased to be working with the Psychiatric Consortium. And it's particularly interesting because it is part of what we call our BBB series, our Building Bridges Between. And this is obviously building a bridge between all the individual players in the development of psychiatric treatment, whether that be the people who actually are suffering in some respect, or clinicians, or scientists, or industry. And so we are attempting here to bring together all the various components of that community to help to improve the levels of collaboration. And I just probably ought to say a few words about collaboration. It is now at the moment the buzzword, and many seminars are being run specifically to talk about collaboration. My view is that it's a very important word, and we need to understand exactly what we mean by collaboration. And for me, it really means a couple of things. It means all parties have common objectives. They have a shared vision, so that we actually all are pulling in the same direction. We bring to the collaboration complementary skills. So we encourage and engage parties which have different capabilities and different components of the overall activities required to deliver a particular program. And there are appropriate incentives for all the parties involved. So we're not there sharing rewards or indeed not sharing risks. We're all ensuring that we take away from the activities the things that are relevant to us. And I think this is an example really of a true collaboration where we are bringing together an industry organization with somewhat of an academic organization, trying to ensure that we can build those bridges and find a way and a route to the future for this really interesting area. So let's move on, and the order of events is going to be, we're going to ask Laura to introduce the Psychiatric Consortium and some exciting new developments, then Ilan to talk a little bit about working with academics, and then Liz to talk a little bit about working with industry, and then finally a Q&A session. So firstly, Laura, if we could ask you just to give us a little bit of background to the Psychiatric Consortium and your latest developments.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Kevin. And thank you to Sophie and the BNA for supporting with this whole series. It's really exciting to be able to talk about research collaboration in psychiatry, not just from one perspective, but to really open this up and broaden the conversation to look at all of the different areas of the pipeline. So I'm really looking forward to this whole 5-part series, and it's great to be here to kick it off with you guys today. So I thought I would give a very brief overview of the Psychiatry Consortium for anyone on the line that doesn't know about us, and give a little insight into some of the work that we've been doing around bringing this community together to try and tackle some of the challenges in psychiatric drug discovery. So the consortium came together in 2019 in response to the challenges of reduced investment and just real difficulty in pulling together psychiatric novel targets and taking them through a drug discovery process. We've partnered with 2 research charities, global pharmaceutical companies and CROs to really combine all of the expertise of these different people in revitalizing drug discovery in this space. I'm sure it's not a huge surprise to anyone on the webinar today that this has really been a struggle in the last 30 years or so. There's been very limited novel treatments, and really trying to identify those novel targets has been a real challenge. So we've come together to really try and revitalise drug discovery in this space. We have £4 million in research funding committed from these partners to really accelerate these early drug discovery projects, and we're working towards a portfolio of up to 10 high-value, high-risk drug discovery projects. And as part of that work, in addition to being a funder and to supporting and bringing all of that expertise together, we're also really working to engage the community and pull everyone together to tackle these challenges as a group. So how we do that is really by acting as a vehicle. We pull from this huge global network of innovators, either from academic, the charity sector, or from SMEs, and we pull them through the Psychiatric Consortium model, which links them with our funding partners who provide that drug discovery commercialization know-how and funding, but it's really more about that really collaborative effort to bring all of the knowledge together in one place rather than just acting as a grant funder. We also work with our partner CROs who support us in providing scientific insights and expertise to develop projects, but also to support delivery where research institutions may not have specialised drug discovery skills or facilities. And we work with Wellcome as well to really support and fund our global academic outreach activities. And finally, all of this is coordinated and overseen by the Medicines Discovery Catapult, who I work for as the programme manager for the consortium. So we pull all of this together and provide day-to-day management and support to the whole group. So as part of that piece of work that we do to really engage the community, we've been doing lots of different events and webinars and workshops and really just trying to start the conversation between lots of different stakeholders. And one example that we're launching today was a landscape report that we've done to really understand the academic and industry perspectives of this drug discovery pipeline, particularly the very early stages. We've conducted interviews, we've conducted surveys, and today this will be available on our website. You'll get a link after the webinar closes to direct you to download the report. So I do encourage you to have a look at that and to see what we've found. But I thought just to kick us off, it's quite a nice example of all of the different ideas that have come together in this space. So I thought I would start this webinar series by just a few highlights of what we found. And I must caveat all of this by saying that this is an N of 29, so it is not a huge number of people that we've talked to or that we've worked with on this, but it is very diverse representation of people from academic or non-profit research organisations, and also those that are working in industry, either SMEs or big pharmaceutical companies. And the majority of the respondents have assets in preclinical, discovery or clinical phases. And it may not come as a huge shock to you, but the really pressing issue that came out of the academic interviews and surveys that we did was that funding is a really huge barrier in this space. It's really challenging to gain funding for that early work, with 69% of academics reported that that was a real challenge for them. That wasn't so much a challenge for the industry cohort, but what did come out of that, which was really across the board, was that this lack of valid targets is really precluding us from developing the pipeline further. 85% and 75% of industry and academic groups noted that that was a real significant barrier to progression. And in these conversations, we had lots of discussions around this lack of confidence, around translational risk, lack of understanding or knowing how to translate a target, how to know whether a target is a valid target, how to know whether something's worth pursuing. And I think these are really good opportunities of these questions where you need multiple stakeholders, not just industry and academia, but patients, clinicians, regulators, all of the people involved in the pipeline to come together and address these questions at the start of that research journey. And the main points that really came out, which is quite interesting, was that we just don't know enough about the underlying biology of psychiatric diseases, and that's a real challenge. That piece around identifying and validating novel targets is really important. And also novel biomarkers and clinical outcome measures are really needed in this field as well. But the most striking finding was that 100% of the people that we spoke to said that they are looking to partner or are partnering at the moment with other research organisations. And all of our industry cohort and the majority of our academic cohort believe that partnering would be beneficial to research and would be extremely valuable in this space. Sometimes academics noted that this would be a great idea, but they just didn't quite know how to initiate those projects. So hopefully in this series, we'll really get an understanding of the different opportunities that are available to academics and industry to really understand how we can work better together. So I will finish there. If you want to find out more about the Psychiatry Consortium or want to collaborate with us, there are several ways in which you can do that, either by working with us on our engagement activities and supporting us on these big challenges, submitting or helping us to deliver a project, or becoming a funding partner and working with us to deliver this exciting science. So I'll be around till the end of the webinar and happy to take any questions on this in the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Laura, many thanks for that. And I would encourage people to take a look at the report that's just very recently come out. I've glanced through it and it's really helpful. Laura, maybe if I just, before we move on to Alana, I could just ask you a couple of questions relating to your presentation then. We'll come back again and ask questions later. Firstly, funding was identified as being something obviously of a challenge in almost every walk of life, but particularly in this area. And I noticed in your introduction, you talked about a £4 million fund. Could you, I mean, maybe for people who are participating, maybe just illustrate how they might get their hands on that, if at all, and whether it is a one-off fund or whether you expect it to continue to be replenished over time?
Yeah, absolutely. We have calls every year that are calls for funding opportunities. Liz is going to go on to talk about in a minute around how she went on to get funding through the Psychiatry Consortium and that experience. So Liz can offer a first-hand experience of how our funding works. But yeah, we have multiple rounds of funding. The next one will become available in the new year, in spring. And we're looking to fund projects that have novel targets that they want to validate in psychiatry.
Okay, thank you very much. And I noticed we have actually quite an international audience on here. So is this fund open to all comers, irrespective of where they're located?
Yes, absolutely. It's global.
That's great. Thank you. And then the other comment you made when reporting on the report was that one of the challenges that many people find is knowing how to initiate a collaboration, how to get in touch with the right people to actually start those discussions. Do you see the Psychiatry Consortium as acting as a sort of a signpost to help to introduce interested parties and who have common interests?
So I think this is something that we really work on in these engagement pieces that we do. We've had lots of different workshops and events before where we've really tried to bring together all of the different stakeholders and form really useful conversations, but then also outputs that come out of this. So this is a nice example of this report that's come out. We've also previously worked on a workshop on the use of animal models and preclinical models in psychiatry and their kind of translatability and validity. And for that, we brought loads of different people together that have since gone on to form a working group to develop some guidelines. So I think our role in this is really bringing those people together and enabling them to go ahead and create outputs that are useful for the whole community.
Brilliant. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be more questions coming towards the end of the session. So maybe I can hand over to Ilan. Ilan, if you wouldn't mind just sort of briefly introducing yourself and the topic of conversation today.
Hi, I'm Ilan Rabiner. I'm wearing two hats. I've got an industry hat as Executive VP of Translation Applications at InVicro. And InVicro is a company that provides advanced imaging facilities, both for academia and for industry, but really focuses on imaging to support drug development. I've also got an academic hat as a reader in molecular neuroimaging at the King's College London Institute of Psychiatry. And I'm a psychiatrist by background, and I've spent the last 25 years or so doing effectively PET imaging for drug development. I guess I'm going to talk about industry academia collaborations from the point of view of industry. I have spent 10 years at GlaxoSmithKline, so where InVicro is a bit of a hybrid organization. It's a service provider for industry. We don't do any of our own drug development, but mostly we have a lot of interactions with industry who are doing drug development. But GSK obviously was a card-carrying drug developer, and had quite a bit of experience with working at academia, both in my current role and my previous roles, and also working with industry from my academic side. So I'm going to just raise a few points that I think are useful to keep in mind when setting up these kind of collaborations, and then give an example of a collaboration which actually is not part of the consortium that Laura has mentioned, but it is a similar, it's an industry academia collaboration that was set up by InVicro with an imaging focus. Sorry, I think. Okay. So I guess the challenges are, I think collaborations, as everybody appreciates, have provide a lot of opportunities. There are complementary strengths. So there's a breadth of knowledge in academia, which is something that it would be difficult for any one or even a combination of pharma companies to put together. On the other hand, industry has the financial and resource background and the depth of knowledge required for turning specific understanding into drug development opportunities. So, you know, in principle, the collaboration can be extremely fruitful. However, there are also some differences that should be recognized, and these differences are really in the focus which each of the partners brings to it. So for academia, of course, the aim is pure science. Ultimately, academics do studies because they're interesting and because they'll lead to publications. That's the currency that academics get paid in. For industry, you know, while there are a lot of excellent scientists in industry, when they wear the industry hat, that is not actually the ultimate aim. whether a publication happens or not is less important of whether the piece of work leads to some useful application to advance drug development. And in principle, very newsworthy, a nature level publication might not be as useful to industry as a well-validated solid paradigm, which might get published in a specialized journal and will be of much more use in a drug development process. Timelines and delivery are, again, another area of different focus. Industry can take a while to get going, they need to get approvals, but once things are set up, tight timelines and delivery on time are super important, simply because decisions, work is done with a view that decisions need to be made at a certain point in the drug development process. Getting the best possible results 6 months later than the decision had to be made, it kind of loses the value of these results. With academia, of course, often things happen, things drift, people leave, students go somewhere else, postdocs move, and timelines can drift, and that can be a real problem for industry. And then the question of IP and publications, and this is a really interesting one, because often this offer, I know a number of situations where that actually, this question scuppered a potential collaboration. And even more frustrating is that often there isn't really much there. It's a question of legal departments in both organizations insisting that they need to share in IP, even when the scientists involved will tell you, there isn't anything really going to come out of it. And these long discussions about potential IP that's never going to really come, never really going to eventuate, is just stopping work that could be going on. And, essentially we're arguing about nothing here. But having the local expertise to be able to persuade your organization that, if these guys want the IP, give it to them, because nothing IP relevant will come out here, and this is just stopping us doing the work, can be very valuable. And from that point of view, it's interesting. Industry is very happy to let people publish. What they will often specify, again, under pressure from legal and company policies, is that they will want to delay the publication, or they will want it done in a certain order, which again sometimes stops work being done, but again practically is not a big problem, because almost everything that we've ever done with industry is available for publication within 2 or 3 years of the end of the study, even in situations where these are asset-related studies tied to a specific drug that's being developed. So again, that often leads to a lot of delays, a lot of discussions, where actually it's not that much of a problem. Another issue to be recognized are the complexities of administrative or funding models. Industry has moved away largely from, there still are some grant-based, where an amount of money is given to an academic researcher who is then allowed to do work, do a piece of work, and the money is given up front. More and more, though, industry likes to provide payments on a milestone basis. So, you do a piece of work, you get paid for that work, which can be a problem for academia when staff need to be hired and you need some guarantee about being able to pay the staff to complete this work. So that is another area that can become problematic. With all that in mind, I think all these points are really there to raise the recognition that there are some differences in focus, and just to be aware of them, because solutions are almost always available once you recognize the background of the kind of request from the other side. So having having somebody with a common knowledge, somebody with an understanding of the academic side of things, understanding of industry constraints and requirements, can be quite useful. That person can serve as a mediator and explain to you, said, look, this is why they're asking for something which sounds very bizarre, but this is the real situation. This is what they need to be able to address. So if we can find a solution to address this, that can advance a particular project or a particular piece of work. So as I say, just some general considerations. And I just wanted to give an example of a particular project which we were able to put together. And this is the Mindmaps program, which is molecular imaging of neurodegeneration in mitochondria-associated proteins and synapses. And this is really a consortium which we at Imanova and now at Invicro have put together, bringing in a number of academic partners and a number of industry collaborators. And the aim really was to develop, to evaluate potential imaging biomarkers that would be useful in monitoring disease progression and neurodegenerative disorders. And this is obviously an interesting area for academia, and for industry, it was put in a way that made it easier for individual industrial partners to explain to their management why they should be taking part in this. So, sorry, I'm just I have a bit of a technical glitch. Yeah, sorry. So why they should be taking part in this. And the aim is really that when pharma develops disease-modifying agents in neurodegeneration, we cannot really rely on clinical studies to get through the first or phase 2 studies, simply because they're too expensive and take too long. So their aim was to try and develop methods which should allow phase 2 studies for initial proof of concept evaluation that would take maximum of 1 year's duration and come within a certain limited budget, really to address the problem of evaluating new medications. So we've put together this consortium, we've structured it as a hub and spokes model where a central group of healthy volunteers and imaging facilities were set up in Imanova. And this was a central group that we've put together, which would be used as a common resource for all the patient groups. And then individual patient groups were put together in collaboration with various academic institutions. So for example, Alzheimer's group was put together in collaboration with Imperial College, Parkinson's with King's, FTD with UCL, ALS with University of Exeter, where each academic group would recruit the subjects, screen them, bring them in for imaging, and then the academics would get their work they would be able to then publish this, taking the lead in publications. On the other hand, all the data would be analyzed centrally by ourselves, and all the data would be pooled with all the academic and commercial partners as a common resource. And this is a program that's been running from 2017, and as you see, we've completed. The yellow are the pieces of work we have completed. Gray are the cohorts still running, and green are the new pieces and the new groups of patients that are going to be coming online. And this is we found this is quite a helpful model. And being able to act as a mediator between industry and pharma, it meant that when new partners are joining, they don't have to negotiate with all the different partners. They just join the consortium. The legal framework is already set up, and it's very flexible and very user-friendly, we think. And that's the end of my few words.
Elan, many thanks for that. And you forgive me, but my internet only locked 3 times during your presentation. The good news, I have a little bit of background, so I know a little bit about the content of it. But I
was
think
just
your
going to say
initial...
that Kevin was, in his time at Ivanova, he was one of the leading proponents of this program and did a lot to get it going.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's good to see it still going. But just you started off your presentation talking a little bit about the differences and the challenges between academia and industry, and I think I'm not going to ask many questions on that just for the time being, because I want to hear Liz's response to that. We can see whether she comes up with a similar set of issues and opportunities. Maybe just a specific question around this particular program, or two questions actually. One is that you've taken on an interesting challenge in that not only are you trying to get industry and academia to work together, you're also trying to get industry and industry to work together, which in its own right can present some challenges. How did you sort of overcome the potential conflict and the competitive situation there?
Well, again, it's an interesting situation. In some ways, getting industry and industry to work together can be easier because they're very clear kind of rules and guidelines where industry will work with other industry and where it won't. So typically anything, of course, anything concerning a particular asset is a no-no. Industry will not share that with other industry. But they recognize that their resources, even though the resources are large, they're limited. And the pre-competitive space, in other words, when you're developing methodologies which multiple partners can use, and especially when you can assure them, as we did here, that there's no particular IP to protect here. You know, this is all, you know, we're just applying things that are in the public domain, and developing these methods are good for everybody. Industry is actually pretty, you know, it's pretty straightforward for them to collaborate. There is quite a lot of cross-industry collaboration going on already, so it's not anything new for them.
Yeah, okay. And obviously this particular program is focused on neurodegeneration. Could you see something similar evolving in the whole psychiatric disease area that addresses those, you know, those issues around affordability and sort of bringing together those complementary skills? Oh,
undoubtedly. You know, so we've had a few, at the time we were setting up, we had a few thoughts about psychiatric programs of similar nature. Of course, at the time, psychiatry has seen a resurgence in the last 2 or 3 years, you know, with ketamine and psychedelics coming on board, and some of the more some of the neuroinflammatory approaches to mood disorders. So I think if we tried the same thing now, we probably would get a better response than we did. This was being planned about 4 or 5 years ago, when, you know, the focus was on neurodegeneration, and
yeah,
you know, this is where I think you need to, as I say, you need to kind of give the industry partners something they can sell their management. At the time, going to management saying that we want to invest money in psychiatric research, says, well, we don't have any compounds in development for psychiatry, so, you know, we're not going to invest now. Now it may well be different.
Interesting. So timing is everything in something like this. Yes, yeah. And the other, sorry, one last point, and then ask Liz to give her introduction. But the other thing is, obviously, Invicro took on the role of acting as the focal point to bring together all these parties. And I think without that, clearly it wouldn't have happened. I guess that one opportunity now that the Psychiatric Consortium exists is for that organisation to play the same pivotal role in bringing together all the parties. And I'm sure Laura's got some examples already of where that's already happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think having that, and that's what I tried to get across in my last point, where you have somebody who can act as a somewhat neutral party, because even for, you know, industry academia, they have a, I guess you might call it an honest broker who can bring them together.
Excellent, thank you. Never heard you call that before.
I tried to put that impression out there.
Thanks very much, thank you. And we'll come back and ask questions a little bit later. So Liz, perhaps we can turn to you and ask you again, if you wouldn't mind just providing a brief introduction before you go into your presentation.
Sure. Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here and to be talking as part of this session today. My name is Liz Humbridge. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford. My background is in neuroscience. I'm not clinically qualified, and my research really focuses on identifying, particularly from genomic information, potential therapeutic targets for major psychiatric disorders, particularly focused on schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and using quite a multidisciplinary and collaborative approach to translate that work. So I use quite a range of cellular and rodent systems. I've done human neuroimaging and behavioral work in both humans and rodents. So it's a very sort of multidisciplinary approach. I'm currently funded primarily by industry, actually, both the Psychiatry Consortium. I have direct grant funding, unusual I hear, from another pharma funder. And I've also had quite a lot of funding in the past from the research councils as well as the Royal Society. So I have kind of an experience with dealing with a range of slightly different funding approaches. So what I thought I'd do today is just to give you a very brief overview of what we're doing with the Psychiatric Consortium, but also I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about the process of applying, because it is very, very different from a standard, say, MRC grant application. So I thought it might be helpful for some of the audience to have an understanding of what that looks like. I'm very happy, Kevin, to talk about those issues related to IP that Alain raised as well. That might be an interesting discussion to have in the Q&A perhaps. So the work that we're doing with the Psychiatry Consortium focuses on a molecule called Calorine. And we became interested in this molecule for a range of reasons. It was actually highlighted by one of my academic collaborators as something that might be interesting. So as I say, I'm really focused on identifying potential therapeutic targets for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And we thought for various reasons that Calorine might be interesting in the context of schizophrenia. So firstly, there's some evidence from genome-wide association studies and rare variant studies that Calorine might be showing genetic associations with illness, particularly with schizophrenia. But really the thing that piqued my interest is that Calorine acts kind of as a hub protein, hopefully you can see in my mouse here, downstream of lots of other proteins that historically we've been very interested in psychiatry. So I've done quite a lot of work on capno1c. Urexin is a molecule that many people will be familiar with. It's downstream of lots of glutamatergic receptors, NMDA receptors. And so it really does seem to be kind of a potential place that you might be able to intervene in schizophrenia-related pathways downstream of all of these sort of primary molecules. Now, what Calorine does, I'm not going to go into great detail, but it's involved in regulating dendritic spine development and plasticity. And we know that this is a process that's perturbed in the brains of patients with schizophrenia, and it's hypothesized to relate to cognitive dysfunction. So we thought that maybe by intervening with Calorine signaling, we might be able to enhance plasticity and thereby potentially improve cognitive function. Although it hasn't been widely studied, there's some evidence that Calorine expression is altered in the brains of patients with schizophrenia. And again, although models are relatively specific at the moment, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, the existing mouse models looking at altered Calorine gene dosage and function suggest that this molecule might be important to processes relevant to schizophrenia, including schizophrenia-related behaviors and long-term potentiation as a standard cellular model of kind of memory to a certain extent. However, that being said, when we started to look into Calorine in more depth and sort of with a particular hat on, I'm very interested in understanding molecular diversity. So most genes don't encode a single product, but they encode a family of products. And it looked like this was going to be very much the case for Calorine. So the question we came to the Psychiatry Consortium with is, okay, we're interested in this molecule Calorine, but what do we mean by that? What exactly is the target? And to explain what I mean by that, this is a kind of cartoon of the Calorine full-length protein. It contains a number of different functional domains. We're particularly focused on these two ROGEF domains that affect GTPase activity and actin dynamics. But Calorine is a really complex gene, and it encodes lots of different starts and lots of different ends. So you can get a family of proteins that include some or all of these different domains. So most of the work that's been done to date has focused on an isoform called Calorine 7, which encodes the start of the Calorine gene. But then when you get after this first ROGEF domain, you get essentially almost like a premature stop, and this contains a PDZ domain. I'll go into that if anyone's interested. But essentially, it just contains one of these ROGEF domains. However, for various reasons, we were interested in the second ROGEF domain because it's much more specific to this protein. And there's some evidence that inhibiting this ROGEF domain might be functionally useful in schizophrenia. And this second rogue F domain forms part of this molecule Cal9, essentially a longer version of Cal7 without the PDZ domain. So it has these two rogue F domains. Now, we know from work that my collaborators and others have done that these rogue F domains are druggable. So our collaborators have developed inhibitors to this first rogue F domain. And really the project that we've been working with the Psychiatry Consortium on is firstly, what is actually expressed from the Calorine locus in human brain? I should say almost all of the proteins that we've looked at, this turns out to be surprisingly unknown. And then secondly, what is the functional significance and druggability of this second rogue F domain? So that's really the work that we're focused on in terms of the consortium. So I'm not going to present any data today because I wanted to focus on the process of application and what we learned from that. It's a very, very different process to a sort of standard MRC grant application. So as scientists, we're used to writing a 6-page case for support, which you send off into the ether, hoping that the reviewers and the panelists look favorably upon you, and you might get the chance to respond to reviewers, but that's it. You don't get any other kind of dialogue during the process. In contrast, the way the Psychiatry Consortium works is essentially you pitch an idea to the pharma partners. When we applied, there were 6 partners. I believe there's now 7, and it's a pre-competitive consortia. So each of the pharmaceutical partners has the option to buy into a particular project. And in order for a project to be funded, you need to have funding from at least 2 of the partners. So in our case, both Biogen and Boehringer Ingelheim were interested in funding this project. So they put money into this pot from their own in-house funds to take this work forward. The process was very kind of iterative and involved a lot of discussion. So it wasn't the case that we put this idea out there and we hope for the best, but actually we had a number of different meetings with the partners, discussed what they liked, what they didn't like, and really the project evolved out of those discussions. So I suppose the thing that I learned is that, like all academics, we put in originally all of the things that are interesting about Calorine, ooh, what does this do? What does that do? How does this get regulated? What's works here? And, but the pharma partners really focused in on the question, what is the target and can we drug it? What's the direct route to a chemical entity, essentially? And so the project that we ended up working on is much more streamlined. It's to characterize what Calorine isoforms are present in the human brain, what they might do to synaptic plasticity, and then can we develop specific inhibitors to target those isoforms. So it's been a really interesting project. I've learned a huge amount. I suppose the positives from an academic point of view, the application process is really relatively painless compared to writing a vast grant application, getting it peer reviewed, all of this stuff. Essentially, the initial expression of interest just said, we're interested in Calorine and here's why we're interested in Calorine and here's some things we think you might want to consider. So it was a very, very brief application. And then on the basis of feedback from the partners, we put together a more fleshed out proposal and pitched it to them, a bit like Dragon's Den. It was all done sort of over Zoom with PowerPoint, but it was very much a dialogue rather than us saying, here's what we're going to do you like it or not? So as part of that process, the grant application became really refined and focused on what we ended up doing. So essentially all of the kind of rabbit hole academic stuff got cut out, and it's a much more streamlined and milestone driven project as a result. The other big advantage I would say over a standard grant application is that we didn't really have any pilot data. We just had an idea. We did generate a bit of data by mining publicly available resources, but this wasn't a project where we had, pilot data from the lab where we said, oh, here's what we know already. It was really just, here's our idea. So it was a very cheap grant application to develop, I suppose, because we didn't have to upfront do any of the work. So those, I guess, are the advantages. What are the disadvantages? I suppose the main one really is that kind of following on from what Ilan said, that there's no overheads as part of this grant. So it was a much more difficult sell to the university than it might have been under other circumstances. That being said, because it's an industry-driven grant, it was strategically important for the university to get this. And I mean, maybe in a Q&A, we can pick up on some of these nuances around university financing and IP and all of this stuff that's come up already. But essentially, I think the thing I've enjoyed most about this is learning about the industry perspective through the process. I should say that since we've been funded, it's not like the funders said, off you go do the work. We have regular meetings with them, we get their feedback, we've tuned what we're doing to answer questions that they have. So it's very much been a collaborative project, collaborative working arrangement. And it's been really good fun to get that different perspective on the work. So I'm really happy to take questions, but I suspect a lot of the more nuanced stuff will come up in the Q&A in the following few minutes.
Thanks very much, and congratulations. I mean, how much did you get?
So, again, a slightly moving target because it's milestoned. Maximum,
okay.
I think, is 450,000.
Wow, that's pretty
that's
good.
the top level, but it is all milestone driven.
Yeah.
Although we're doing well
great.
with our milestones. So
Right. It's great to hear that hear a success story, and the fact that you've learned, I guess, an awful lot about the language of pharmaceutical development through that process. I guess it begs the question then, for those people that didn't succeed, what did they learn? And that's a rhetorical question, because of course nobody's here to answer that question. But it's an area I think that we need to explore further, and that is how do we share the understanding of the requirements of pharmaceutical development across a broader academic community, so that actually they enhance their likelihood of success first time round, rather than sort of feeling as though they're going to have to go around and round again. And again, I think that's probably part of what we could try to deliver through this program, and something ongoing I think that we need to think about as well.
I think there is a great point. I think it's a great question, and perhaps that's something that Laura could, and obviously anonymized, but maybe give some kind of a summary of the applications that were not successful. What were the major, kind of the most common reasons why they weren't successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is actually something that I do feel very passionately about, is providing feedback to people who haven't reached the kind of funding stage of the Psychiatry Consortium, because it's a big part of what we do is about supporting the research community, and a big drive that I've tried to bring to the consortium is that we're not just a grant funder that sends you off and lets you get on with the work for 3 years. It is, as Liz said, it's very involved, and I think Liz did a very good job of talking about the pros and cons whilst I was sat here watching. So
hopefully nothing surprising.
I haven't bribed her at all. I think it's very tricky for the Psychiatry Consortium because our scope is so narrow. It's been specifically set up to validate novel targets in psychiatry. So there aren't that many novel targets in psychiatry. So the main reason that a lot of proposals don't progress through our funding schemes is because of a lack of novelty. It's something that we're working really hard to try and mitigate, because there are you can find novelty in approaches to modulating existing targets. Maybe that's a new direction, but when we're working with these pharmaceutical companies who have been working in this area for a really long time, sometimes they have just been burned in the past by programs that haven't worked, and so getting their input and internal approval to carry on working on something that has failed multiple times just isn't going to happen. So sometimes it just is a case of we've been there and done that. But we really do try and, as Liz said, build these projects with academics so that we're really trying to put all of that information in, pull it together.
Thanks
I suppose the other
Laura.
thing that I know anecdotally from, so I should say I've also been unsuccessful in applying to the Psychiatry Consortium, so I'm not like 100% hit rate. And I think probably what was specifically quite different about this project was that it did have quite a clear path to an actual kind of inhibitor or compound. It was very much set up to say, what's the target? What does it do? Can we drug it? And I suspect that a lot of the proposals are missing that last goal, even if you're not going to do the medchem yourself. I think some of the other applications that we put in that weren't successful were much more academic. Oh, look, there's this over here and that over there, which might be really interesting as an MRC grant application, but it's not going to pique the interest of the industry partners. I think it's that very clear pathway to therapeutics that made this project different.
I think it's finding the balance of bringing the right people together to fund this research, because there have been instances where research projects have been very interesting and very exciting, but they're too early. And we come across this quite a lot, in that there's just so much understanding of the biology that needs to be done first before you can create a drug discovery program. And from experience of working with industry, it's not necessarily that's not where they have the most input. That's where the research councils and the kind of the likes of the research funders who do that typical grant type of funding can really add a lot of value in really building up our understanding of the biology, so that when industry are coming in, it's not to fund that basic research, it's to do what they do best and to support that drug discovery process.
Thanks, folks. We had some questions come through, so maybe and time marches on. So if I could maybe help to address some of the questions coming from the audience, some quite quick, some a little longer perhaps. The people have put their name in here, so I'm going to mention the name of the people asking the question, if you don't mind. So Lindsay Marshall is asking about the working group to evaluate translational potential, and she wonders if that was purely for animal models or whether it will also take into account the possible predictive value of other non-animal approaches, maybe including volunteer clinical studies.
So that work is ongoing at the moment. The full details can be found on the resources section of the Psychiatry Consortium website, so you can find out more about it there. But at the moment, that is preclinical, not just animal to preclinical tools, but it is very much focused on that preclinical section. Okay,
thank you very much. Thank you. And as sort of a question really for Laura, I think, is around funding generally. You felt the need to go to, well, not felt the need, you saw the opportunity to go to this source of funding to support your ongoing research. Is that because you found it very challenging to find and have confidence in funding from other sources?
Question to me?
Yes, sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Yes,
Too many L's on the call.
I should have said. Did I say Laura? Forgive me.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I was sort of struck when Laura was talking. I fully understand industry feeling that the research council should be putting in the legwork to get the basic science done. But I suppose the experience is that process is relatively random. You know, I've had success with research councils and I've had failures with the research councils, and I don't know that there's a particularly good correlation between how strong the proposals were. I think there's an element of lottery, for want of a better word, in that process. I suppose I think the tension here, and it's quite an interesting tension, is that in a sense, yes, it should be that the research councils are funding the basic biology and then the industry are taking that on. But I think the way the system is set up at the moment is not so well designed to actually facilitate that. So, you know, I suppose the hardline perspective as an academic is that this funding scheme doesn't actually provide overheads. It funds the research, it funds, you know, the consumables, it funds the people, but it doesn't fund overheads. Now, from an academic point of view, that's a real bargain, because my grant from another farmer gives over 100% overhead. So, right, you know, that's a big chunk of money and that's valuable to the university. Being quite blunt and frank, if I had a really strong application with really strong IP, I probably wouldn't take it to this scheme. I would take it to the research councils, and I have done that for other grants. For me, the benefit of this scheme is that we didn't have to have vast amounts of background data. It wasn't something we've been working on for years. It literally was just an idea that we thought was interesting. And so I think some of the tension there between academia and industry is around this idea of overheads. I think industry often thinks that they're funding, you know, the Sheldonian or whatever it is at university, but actually they're funding the lights being on, my freezer alarms, computers, you know, all of these things that are necessary to research but aren't included in salaries and overheads. And I think that is still a big tension in working in this space. It is surmountable, but it is a challenge.
And Ilana, there was sort of a related question to you around things like the Mindmaps program, and whether you see that's a model that could create increased sustainability in research in this area, or are there going to be restrictions, as Liz has articulated, which means that it's good on a one-off basis, but it will never become a major component of combined research activity?
It's a good question. I think. Yeah, I think it might not. I mean, I guess this is where difference. So I think the basic principle of these kind of interactions is that it's not. I don't think they're designed to provide a stable basis of funding for an academic for their career. I mean, that's really where the research councils are. That's the role of the research councils, and universities to provide that stable basis. So the way I see these kind of collaborations are to address specific problems, as like Liz says, it's to address specific ideas that came up. You know what, this is an interesting idea. You might take it to MRC, which will probably fund you with overheads, but it might take 18 months to actually get anywhere. You take it to industry, and if they like it, you could get funded within a period of months. But it is a particular program, and I think also, as we mentioned, timing is everything. Something that scientific interest might remain the same, but in a particular timing for industry, now it's something that they're interested in, they will fund. In a year's time, focus shifted, strategy changed, and they will not fund it. So these are really projects to address specific problems, I would say.
I think just to pick up on that as well, it's something that we really benefit from in the approach that we have with the consortium is that it is a syndicate, in that multiple partners are sharing the cost of the research. So there could be projects that are of interest, they are novel, they're worth doing, and all of the research that we get is very worthwhile. But maybe one pharmaceutical company on their own wouldn't take that risk on because it's so early, it's a huge amount of work needs doing, and it's going to cost an awful lot of money. But if we get 5, 6, 7 partners together, they each get to be a part of that initial journey and get a stake in that foothold in that world of the research for a fifth or a sixth of the cost. So I think it works really well when you've got something that is very high risk and is a real challenge. And that's where the Psychiatric Consortium can have a really great benefit. And it's absolutely not intended to fix all of the funding problems or all of the challenges in psychiatric drug discovery, because there are many, but what it does do is target that very small niche and help in that area.
I think that's quite valuable, because I think, unfortunately, over the last 20 years or so, academic research, which should be high risk, blue sky ideas, unfortunately, with all of it, is becoming more and more conservative, and people are reluctant. Ooh, I don't know if I should do this. Not sure if it'll get me the next grant. I think these opportunities are valuable because they allow people to take risks. You know what? 80% chance it won't work. If it does work, it'll be great. So somebody just needs to take a punt and.
Folks, I'm going to have to, there's so many questions coming through, I'm not going to be able to go through all of them, but just one last one maybe to Laura. And you mentioned earlier on about the role of regulators and the importance of them being an integral part of this collaboration. We know that psychiatric diseases in their own right are very difficult to pin down, and therefore endpoints and things like clinical trials are often quite challenging. But are the regulators really buying into the need to look at things differently and the need to engage in this type of activity?
So this is something that came up a lot in the discussions around preclinical models and utilising them in drug discovery, in that we need to be having more conversations with regulators around that process of, for some, not using animal models because they don't believe in the behavioural work or they're not translatable, and what's the point, but at the same time needing to jump that hurdle. So I think it is part of a much bigger conversation of how we conduct preclinical research. Yeah. But I think something that the consortium does quite well, and will try to do well, is lining up all of the pieces in the research process so that everyone, whether that is regulators or preclinical industry academic scientists, have an awareness and an understanding of the next step in the chain. So you're lining up your research to have the most chance of translation at the next stage. And I think that's something that this webinar in particular and the following 4 webinars really focus on, in understanding everyone's perspective. So today we've had industry and academics and different approaches to that relationship, and everything that we're doing in this collaboration with the BNA, but in all of our work, is really trying to understand how the next step in the chain, what they need, what they're doing, why they're doing it. And I think that applies to regulators, but also to all of the other people in the group as well.
Laura, thank you very much. And I need to close up now. So just leave you with thanks to Laura, to Alan, and to Liz for their contributions and some hopefully some ongoing conversations that we've illustrated here, and also, of course, to the BNA and the Psychiatric Consortium for pulling together the seminar series. I encourage all our listeners to dial into the next set of series. We probably get in a little bit more science, a little bit more about some of the challenges that people are facing, but I hope this has been a great taster for what that series will look like, and hope to join you again in Seminar 5. So thanks everybody for dialing in, and have a good afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.